Focus a little bit on domestic politics, obviously with Iowa and New Hampshire coming up. You said recently about Vice President Biden, his record, you said to the Washington Post, quote, it's just a lot of baggage that Joe takes into a campaign, which isn't going to create energy and excitement. Is there something specifically you were referring to in terms of baggage?
Sure. I mean, look, Joe and I are friends, and I truly like Joe. But what is imperative is that we defeat Trump, the most dangerous president in modern history. And that means you're going to have a huge voter turnout. You're going to have to get working people excited. You're going to have to get young people excited. Joe Biden voted and helped lead the effort for the war in Iraq, the most dangerous foreign policy blunder in the modern history of this country. Joe Biden voted for the disastrous trade agreements like NAFTA and permanent normal trade relations with China, which cost us millions of jobs. You think that's going to play well in Michigan or Wisconsin or Pennsylvania? You know, Joe Biden has been on the floor of the Senate talking about the need to cut Social Security or Medicare or Medicaid. Joe Biden pushed a bankruptcy bill, which has caused enormous financial problems for working families. So if we're going to beat Trump, we need turnout. And to get turnout, you need energy and excitement. And I just don't think that kind of record is going to bring forth the energy that we need to defeat Trump.
Senator Elizabeth Warren.
I actually agree with him. I completely agree with him. If you're looking at how to win an election, turnout will be essential to that process. And that means having people energized and having people wanting to go out there and work and push for you. One of those ways of doing that is having policies and speaking to their material needs as individuals within the society. Sanders does that. Sanders is pushing that case. Somebody on his team has been watching this show, because this show has been saying that you have to hit him in his mass. That's with an M-A-S-S, not in his ass. What I mean by that is one of Joe Biden's key sticking points has to do with electability, the elderly, and African Americans, meaning older African Americans. If that's the case, then those are the places where you need to go and get votes. The younger generation is already not voting for him, so hitting him in that aspect doesn't entirely do it. My argument was you need to pull votes from this notion that Joe Biden is the more electable candidate, especially since I actually don't believe Joe Biden is the more electable candidate. You look at John Kerry, you look at Hillary Clinton, and Al Gore. The last three corporate candidates, and Joe Biden is just another one of them, lost. Obama, who was supposed to be something different in turning of the page, won. An African American with a Muslim name that went screaming from pillar to post about hope and change. No, he didn't do it. But the mask that he wore in order to win that race was something definitively different. It's not just Sanders. The other campaigns have started to zero in on this. Elizabeth Warren, when thinking about electability, it would be a complete malpractice to nominate someone who conspired in back rooms for years with credit card lobbyists and voted for every corporate bankruptcy bill, Wall Street deregulation, and trade deal that voters hate, said Adam Green, the group's co-founder. I'm sorry, that wasn't Warren. This was right here. Warren and Buttigieg have not been as direct. The Progressive Change Campaign Committee, a group that has functioned as Warren's political enforcers. Okay, there we are. That's why I thought it was Warren. But Buttigieg has also hit him on this notion of the Iraq war vote, again, going with this notion of electability. And even Andrew Yang, something that I agree with. Someone who suggests that coal miners should become coders is generally neither of those things, Andrew Yang said. And that's interesting coming from Yang, seeing as Yang and Biden has had kind of this odd affinity for one another when they've talked about each other. Well, Biden is not taking this lying down. And people who are allies of Biden are not taking these attacks on Joe Biden's electability lying down. Effectively, they are swift-boating Joe Biden on his strong suit, swift-boating over back to John Kerry and the way that they hit John Kerry on this notion of his military service. That was supposed to be a strong suit. They hit him in a strong suit, and John Kerry was unable to essentially deal with those attacks. I'm making the point that you don't necessarily have a choice but to hit Joe Biden in this very specific point. And apparently the other campaigns have been watching the show also and have ganged up on that very specific case. Sanders and Warren are considered risky. Sanders, really, if we're being honest, is the really only competitor at this point with Joe Biden. But he's considered risky. I'm saying both of them because those two are considered the lefties in this race. Joe Biden, by like 20 points, pretty much in every poll, is considered a safe bet. If you don't think he's a safe bet, you need to make that case. And you need to make that case, especially if your name is Bernie Sanders. And the only way Sanders probably would ever try to make that case is on policy grounds. What you just heard from right there with Anderson Cooper, he didn't slander, he didn't smear him. All of those things were policies that were bad choices that Sanders is making the case will be a detriment when he's going into Wisconsin, into Michigan, into Pennsylvania, and these states that we need to win that in this last election we lost. Joe Biden is not taking this line down, and his allies have come up with I would consider to be a hysterically desperate attack. Bernie's a commie. I'm sorry. It's the shy man's way of saying Bernie's a commie. Essentially, Bernie's a closet commie. I'll tell you what I mean. Welcome to the Soapbox. My name is Jamarl Thomas. This is the Progressive Soapbox. Guys, if you dig this content, please like, share, subscribe. You can always support. PayPal, Patreon, even $1 helps because this content is brought to you by you. I've argued electability has to be one of the attack points for Sanders. This is not an attack point that you can make in passing. This is something that you need to press, you need to run into, you need to put all of your weight into, like your life depended on it, as if the devil himself was chasing you in a hot rod and you were running, ass out. You got to make the case. You can't make it in passing. What you said on Anderson Cooper is great, but you also need to keep into account the areas that you need to pull support from. The elderly, there's no Social Security. That should not be a passing argument. That should not be a throwaway argument. That is a big deal. I can show you the video where Joe Biden is talking about cutting Social Security. In fact, right here, I even have it up. Joe Biden pulling an elderly population. Do they trust him when they have videos of him saying this?
Paul Ryan was correct. When he did the tax code, what's the first thing he decided we had to go after? Social Security and Medicare. Now, we need to do something about Social Security and Medicare. That's the only way you can find room to pay for it.
Right here. Does that make you more comfortable with Joe Biden in this case? All Democrats are not created equal. I hope you understand that. Just because somebody has a D beside their name doesn't necessarily mean they're going to stand up and fight for Medicare and Social Security, regardless of all the belly aching they make about this. Bill Clinton, if it wasn't for Monica Lewinsky and that blowjob, Bill Clinton made a deal with Newt Gingrich to cut Social Security, to privatize Social Security. This is kind of the point that I'm making at here. It's not necessarily a foregone conclusion that these services will be protected just because you have a Democrat in the office. That case should be pressed, not as a throwaway. That is a big, big deal, especially to a population that is backing the guy who's talking like that. Joe Biden and his allies have brought out their response. Yeah, they brought up their response. Now, this is what they're threatening. Let's say it that way. Let's use the term threatening. So right here. Right here. Biden's allies particularly suggested they will welcome a debate with their major challenger on foreign policy issues. Bernie's the only presidential candidate who talked up Soviet Union and said bread lines were indicative of a healthy economy. One Biden ally said, if he really wants to go there, God bless him. Now, when I first heard that, I thought to myself, I was like, wow, that's hyperbolic. Sanders, the only thing Sanders mentioned was policy issues, and he's gone to this smear about bread lines. Now, what Sanders was talking about there, just to explain, was that some people, some countries are dirt poor, and some countries don't have those bread lines, meaning those people just starve. Meaning all things being equal, if you have a poor country, all things being equal between not having something to eat and having something to eat, you prefer something to eat. Now, they're making this as if he's saying this was the model of a great society. That's not what he was going at, but that's almost somewhat irrelevant. This is hyperbolic. And not just hyperbolic, this is, I thought, hysterical. Now, my first thought was, does this have legs? When you're looking at some of the early polling, I haven't seen it recently, but it said Sanders or the socialist thing was something that people were dodgy about. By the same token, if you ask them about Sanders, they were okay with Sanders. This, the black friend thing. It's this thing out there that I have an impression about. But I know this one. This guy I know. And because I know this guy, he's okay. It's that phenomena. The question becomes, does that phenomena work as it goes out into the main election? Personally, I think it would. And if you're looking at the way the national polling goes, clearly those people know he's identified himself as a socialist. And fact of the matter is, if you support Sanders, you can't run away from it anyway. Either way, you run away from it, it's going to chase you. You have to own it. Well, he has owned it. That's good. The only reason you would bring this up, is if you can't defend what you're talking about. If you and I are having a policy debate, and I say, I think you're less electable because of NAFTA, because of your support, if I'm not mistaken, the TPP, but I could be wrong on that one, but definitely NAFTA, permanentized relations with China, the cutting of Social Security, the credit card bill, where your son was essentially leeching this kind of weird soft corruption, if they want to call it soft. The crime bill, where knowingly putting African Americans in prison. I guess I'm even the Hunter Biden stuff that's just kind of looming out there with this notion of corruption. My point is, one issue after the next, you can make an argument, policy argument, that Biden is a problem when running against Trump. Just on policy. Even the Iraq war vote, especially since what's taking place in Iraq right now is derivative of that vote and that policy of going into Iraq. Joe Biden is lying about that, by the way, saying that he was immediately against it after shock and awe. Whatever. 9 months later, he was still trumpeting that war. My point is, if I am making a policy argument that you are less electable because of the various policies that you've taken, these policies that materially disadvantage the people within the society itself, and you turn around and point to me and say you supported commies, something wrong here. Something's wrong here. Like, my point is, this is the right argument. This line of attack with this notion of him being a shadow commie, ultimately this is Bernie Sanders is a shadow communist, or at the very least he has an affinity for communists. He just doesn't want to outright say it. That's an astonishing thing to say, that's all. It gets across this kind of point that you can't defend your position. This is the argument to make. I don't necessarily think Joe Biden has legs. And if you are Sanders, you have to press this with all the vigor and the powers that are at your disposal. The other candidates have gone after Biden on this, but Sanders has been the most pointed, at one point calling his record weak. And yes, in a foreign policy argument, Sanders should be absolutely willing to have that fight. Here's the thing. If you thought that you were going to be able to get out this election without being called a commie and a socialist, you were thinking improperly about this election. I was here in Virginia where they were running ads, hysterical ads, with a guy like hugging Stalin or something. Like they were calling the guy a communist, they were calling the guy a socialist. I mean, these are horrible ads. And I'm looking at the TV like, I can't believe this is being run on television. Yes, that was being run on television, and that will be run on television all across the United States. All across the United States. There will be elements of the Democratic Party itself that will even be hoping and praying for your downfall. I guess I'm making a point to you that, yes, bad things were going to be said about you. The fact that Joe Biden is willing to go here, at the very least his allies are willing to go here almost immediately, gets across that there is a deficit here, a weakness here that needs to be exploited. Otherwise, you wouldn't have this kind of caveman in rags swinging a stick at a bunch of hyenas. I'm shocked that this is the thing that they went to in this. Now, the thing is, I think this is twofold. this is potentially a preview by some of the attacks that may be used by his allies. It's even a preview of potentially an attack that may be used by Joe Biden on a debate stage if this is brought up. The fact of the matter is, Joe Biden's electability should be brought up. That argument should be pressed, and it shouldn't just be pressed on one issue. It should be pressed on a host of issues, all thrown out at once, where Joe Biden needs to explain himself all at once. I find this to be infinitely necessary. If your candidate has a glass jaw, you need to find out in the primaries. This notion of kumbaya in the primary, I don't quite understand. It's a contest. Everybody in this contest is trying to ideally win this contest. If your name is Sanders, it gets a little bit more dicey because you have a lot of people who are against you almost as working as one in the contest of sorts because you're a factor to yourself. Nevertheless, you're in the number 2 spot. It's possible that the polls are undercounting the number of people who are going to come out for you. You are an amazing placement. And the argument that you need to make to peel away that the last 5 or 10% out of Joe Biden's hide is this man is not more electable. He has a host of problems associated with him. And here's the list. And do it on the debate stage. Not just your acolytes behind you, not just on CNN. You must do it in front of a live audience for people can see it, so the media can pick it up, so media can start asking questions. Is he more electable? Yeah, Joe Biden did try to cut Social Security, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. That's just my advice. If I was in a room, that's what I will be telling you. You don't have to be a bad guy. And even in that clip with Anderson Cooper, it was all policy. It was all policy. If Joe Biden or his acolytes want to start calling Sanders a commie, bring that. That is an argument that is perfectly okay to have. There's a section of the electorate. Yes, they may be reactive to that, but that section of the electorate would have never voted for Sanders at all, considering that he had a socialist on his name anyway. The catch becomes, is that argument more precise as opposed to the argument that Joe Biden has failings that can be exposed just like John Kerry, just like Al Gore, just like Hillary Clinton? And is it a more pressing argument to say these failings are what cost you guys the elections last time? I am bringing you a different mindset for what it means, A, to be a Democrat, but also a political revolution that benefits the material interests of the 95% of the population, something that has not been attended to for generations. Oh, this is fascinating. The gloves are coming off. Look, Sanders is considered a risky prospect. So it behooves him to also make it very clear that Joe Biden is a risky prospect. You need to tear in this notion of his credibility, tear in this notion that he is more electable. You need going after him on this very particular point. It can't be enough that you seem a risky prospect. He also needs to seem a risky prospect. On a second note, you also need to win the first few states. Winning Iowa and New Hampshire puts that much more doubt into Joe Biden's electability notion, which is effectively what needs to take place if Sanders is going to have a path to victory. That was another thing that came out today that I thought was just awesome. I've been making it right here. Where is it? There have been many articles that have started coming out about concerns that the Biden campaign has started to have about Sanders. And people are starting to talk. Now, I don't quite understand why they weren't talking earlier about this, because I sure was. But people are starting to talk. They should have been talking earlier. At the very least, the gloves have started to come off. And this credibility argument or electability argument is going to be put to the test. At least I hope it is. I hope this is not Sanders fainting one thing and then not bringing it up later. But this is the argument that needs to be made. One of the trends is that Joe Biden is retaining a lead in the polling. This is the argument that needs to be made. My opinion, my point of view. Like, share, subscribe.